In the PBM space, the same entity that's servicing and making decisions on behalf of their employer client is also making decisions related to rebates coming from pharmaceutical companies, making decisions related to pricing at the pharmacies, at the retail pharmacies, mail order pharmacy, specialty pharmacy. So they're really in the middle, and whose interest are they representing as they make decisions?
Welcome to Claim Talk. I'm your host, Danielle Young, and today we have some experts here to discuss with us what's going on in the world of pharmacy and pharmacy benefit management. So I'm going to have our guests introduce themselves here in a moment, but we wanted to record these episodes because we wanted to bring a little bit of knowledge to the market around all things pharmacy for some of our broker partners who are perhaps a little bit less comfortable with that space. We frequently work with broker partners who will say, yeah, we love ClaimDoc and we want to use ClaimDoc, but who are we going to use for a TPA or a PBM? And so we want to start diving a little bit deeper into some of those ancillary kind of concepts so that our broker partners and the rest of the market can get to know a little bit more about the folks that we like to work with. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll go right down the line here. Mark, why don't you introduce yourself? Give us a little bit of background about you.
Sure. Thanks, Danielle. Glad to be here. My name is Mark Sweeney. I'm a pharmacist. I'm from Ohio, and I've been in pharmacy for over 30 years. I am trained as a pharmacist, and I've done a number of things in my career, including owning pharmacies. I started 2 colleges of pharmacy, was a dean for a school of pharmacy. I've past president of the Ohio Pharmacists Association, but for the last 13 years, I've been working with pharmacy benefit optimization, and we've been basically working with employers and brokers to optimize their pharmacy benefits, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Do you even pharmacy, bro? It's a joke on a joke.
It's not bro anymore. It's bra. It's
bra now?
Yeah, that's what they're all saying.
All right.
Yeah. When was the last time you were behind the counter, Mark? That's what she's asking.
So,
yeah, right, exactly.
That's a very good question. So my wife and I actually do own a pharmacy, and so sometimes I'll support my wife because she's a real pharmacist behind the counter, as you would say. So
very cool. Awesome.
I did that last year.
Nice. Trevor.
Cool. Well, I'm Trevor Dare. I'm the founder of Granite Peak Analytics. I'm an admitted self-funding nerd. So most of my background is in the TPA self-funding space. And about 5 years ago, I decided to take the crazy leap into pharmacy benefit optimization, as Mark calls it. I really do have a passion for self-funding and risk financing and how the pharmacy component plays into that. And I really, I like to leverage a lot of experts in other areas as well, which is always nice to have a pharmacist on board because I'm just an insurance guy. But we're going to be talking about patients and health plans and how, how the plans we build actually impact humans. So I think it's always important to bring not only a risk financing perspective, but a clinical perspective.
Cool.
I don't pharmacy, bruh.
So you're not as much as a pharmacy bruh.
Yeah.
As
I've been behind a counter, but not the counter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We won't go into details about why you were behind the counter.
Yeah. Sounds good. Mike?
Yeah. Mike Krupa. Interesting background. I'm actually a former home remodeler. Did that during college. Fell into insurance like most people, failed actuary. So I got through a few of the exams, decided I didn't want to do that anymore, but have been really on the financial side my whole career. And 5 years ago, started kind of remodeling health plans. Took a lot of the concepts I learned from when I was remodeling homes with my twin bra. And now I'm doing that with employers and have a brand out there called Remodel Benefits, which is really just a strategic process to help move employers into a high performance health plan. And I'm a boy dad. So I got 3 little boys at home and they're the best and they're loud.
Awesome. Very cool. So I think the first topic I want to jump into, and before we start, I want to self-identify as not a pharmacy bra. I don't know very much about it. I knew just enough to be dangerous as a broker. And actually, as a broker, when I was working in my former life, I leaned on Mark for pharmacy knowledge quite a bit because I had almost none. I knew that GLP-1s were expensive and that it was cheaper to get certain medications out of Canada than it was domestically here. But other than that, I didn't know a lot. So I'm going to really lean on you 3 today for the knowledge part of our podcast. But I wanted to start with the concept of pharmacy benefit managers as co-fiduciaries or fiduciaries, because that's something we talk about a lot on this podcast. That's something we talk about a lot here at ClaimDoc. We co-fiduciary with our client partners. So who wants to take a stab at defining what a fiduciary relationship for a PBM looks like? Is that up your alley, Mark? You up to the task?
I was going to say maybe we should, before we say a fiduciary responsibility for a PBM, maybe we should just define the word fiduciary.
Okay. Yeah.
And maybe that would be a good starting point. I don't know if one of you guys want to.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the most important thing of a fiduciary is you are acting in the best interest of the beneficiaries of the health plan. Just plain and simple. Like everything you're doing should be in the interest of them, because at the end of the day, they're paying into the health plan as well.
So then when a PBM is a co-fiduciary, what does that entail?
So to take that definition, the PBM should operate and conduct business in the best interest of their clients, which would be the employers, often in the self-funded space. And I guess the question is that actually happening in the market? Are PBMs functioning as fiduciaries in the best interest of their clients?
That's a good question.
I think it's really interesting because when you think about how ClaimDoc in their role like contractually becomes a co-fiduciary of the plan, we don't see that. We believe that a PBM cannot technically be a co-fiduciary of the plan just in their role, but they can act in a fiduciarily prudent manner. They can act in alignment with their clients, which would be their employers and the patients. And 80% of the market, we would say, is not aligned from a fiduciary standpoint. And so that's why you see, continued double-digit trend in pharmacy and things like that, because of the misaligned incentives that, there's lines in the majority of PBM contracts that say they're not fiduciaries, and please don't even consider them as one. And it's evident in how they operate.
Let's tease out some examples of how a pharmacy or a pharmacy benefit manager would be acting not in alignment with the fiduciary best interest of a client. What are some examples of that type of behavior?
Yeah, if I'm thinking about it, when there is a cheaper alternative that is equally effective that can be taken, but a more expensive alternative is what is being pushed, to me, that is not acting in the best interest of the beneficiary, which is the plan participant, the employer, or the employee, the spouse, the child.
And when you say alternative, you're talking about a clinical alternative.
Clinical alternative.
Okay.
And to go deeper into that, why would a more expensive alternative being facilitated or fostered by the PBM?
Because they're making more money.
More money. Yeah. A friend of mine used an example. If you were buying a house and your realtor told you, well, I'm also not only operating on your behalf, but also the buyer's behalf, the seller and the buyer is represented by the same individual. Could they operate as a fiduciary?
No.
Right.
And you would say, wait a minute. Wait a second. Right. Why are we doing
Why are we doing it? You would feel uncomfortable if your realtor was operating both on buyer and seller. I mean, I think we would all feel uncomfortable with that.
That's right.
But in the PBM space, the same entity that's servicing and making decisions on behalf of their employer client is also making decisions related to rebates coming from pharmaceutical companies, making decisions related to pricing at the pharmacies, at the retail pharmacies, mail order pharmacy, specialty pharmacy. So they're really in the middle. And whose interest are they representing as they make decisions?
I really like the PBMs that own multiple pharmacies, and so then they're paying themselves. So with the employer and patient's checkbook, right? It's like you just sit back and think about that. You're like, I'm contracting with the PBM to negotiate pricing with the pharmacies, but they own the pharmacies, and just trust that they're going to pay them less or keep costs under control, right? And that's part of the misalignment that we see in the industry is you can't act on both sides, right? You can't act as a fiduciary to your wholly owned pharmacy chain and in the best interest of your employer clients and the patients. It's impossible to serve both of those masters.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point about a PBM that owns pharmacies, whether it be a specialty or a mail or even retail pharmacies. And in the industry, we talk, and we'll probably get to this, we talk a lot about transparency. We want PBM transparency. But what often happens, we get transparency maybe through the PBM, but the transparency seems to end at the pharmacy level. So if the PBM owns the pharmacy, we don't get any transparency at the profitability of that pharmacy, even though they're owned by the PBM that's making decisions on behalf of the employer group. So again, there's a convoluted drug pricing infrastructure that exists. And wherever you have that convoluted, complex infrastructure, there's opportunity to bury money and to reduce transparency and accountability.
Which also means as a broker, there is a ton of opportunity when you're talking to a new employer and you're looking at their data. That's what I love is pharmacy is such low-hanging fruit for an employer to try to tackle first. I mean, it's easy.
Right. Yeah. I remember hearing, tell me if this still happens. I'd be curious to see if this is something that happens. I remember hearing several years ago that there were other brokers when I was still a broker out in the market that were getting paid per script being filled on the plan. Is that a thing that still happens?
Yeah, that still happens. We had an account we took over probably 3 years ago, and they were getting paid about 50 cents per script. One of the companies I used to work for, I was very heavily involved in some of the override programs, which is ultimately what got me to leave that company. But
good for you.
I mean, they were getting paid almost $3 PEPM across their entire book of business over the nation. I mean, it was millions of dollars they're getting paid from these, not even a PBM, but from an aggregator.
Right. Wow.
Well, and that speaks to the whole notion of, we talk about PBM fiduciary responsibilities, but what about broker responsibilities as well? And if you're being paid to keep a PBM in place that may not be in the best interest of that client because you're making money off of that, are you really making the best decisions for your clients? So
yeah,
that's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's impossible to be unbiased at that point, right? Because even if you're the best human in the world, money will impact your advice.
Your judgment,
your advice. So
I
I think
system too, right? It's like you think about like, dude, we're all good people. I'd like to think most people are good people, but you get stuck in this system that is doing it this one way, and it's just this machine, and you get caught up into it. Like happened to me at previous employers too, and eventually, maybe you'll see the light.
right?
Yeah, we had just a quick story. When we first started out just over 5 years ago, we landed a TPA client. Our first one, we were really excited about it and went through the RFP procurement process for their PBM and realized very quickly that we could, a very, very small TPA, we could make 6 figures on it and they would feel happy about it. It was almost like the car salesman. It's like, hey, you might be overpaying, but as long as you feel good about it, it's okay.
Right.
And
Gross.
it was very evident at that time where like, we cannot be part of this problem. And as a startup company, it was hard to,
walk away from the money.
walk away from that
money.
because now we still have that client and that's probably why. But we make about 12 grand a year on that customer.
Right.
So it's so easy. Like you said, the machine, the money that's thrown around that can influence your decisions. And ultimately in our roles as advising employers, it's hard in this environment to stay clean. And so that becomes one of our differentiators is we don't take money from PBMs. And it's crazy though. And I hope my clip of like, I really like the PBMs that own pharmacies doesn't find its way on its own.
Oh,
my sarcasm.
I read the sarcasm. Yeah. I don't know if the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
Sarcasm.
You'd be like, oh, really?
Yeah, right. They're like,
We can turn that into a clip.
yeah. Now it's going to be a teaser. I hope you understand that.
That would actually be a really good teaser.
Yeah.
They're like, what
is he saying?
What? Well, the other thing I was going to make mention, and there is a difference between fees being paid for the purposes of commission versus fees that are being paid. It can be also a mechanism to pay for services as well, for simplicity. And I wanted to clarify that because sometimes that can be missed, that a service is being provided and the PBM is invoicing on behalf of a consultant or a client or a broker. And there's actually a service component to that.
Totally.
Which is a different scenario.
Totally agree. A lot of brokers get a bad rap for taking commissions. And, a lot of people don't realize, like in Illinois with Blue Cross, for example.
That's the only way you can get paid.
That's all. That's it. We can't even strip them out and charge a fee. And totally agree with you, Mark. The client we took over, the part that bothers me is when the client doesn't know that fee is baked in there, right? To your point, if you're transparent about your fee structure, it doesn't really matter where you're making the money and how you're making the money. The issue is the lack of transparency and the lack of the employer knowing what they're paying for that.
And
right?
the absence of value,
Yes.
right? So if you're making 50 cents a script on the pharmacy program, there's nothing inherently wrong with that as long as you're being transparent and telling the employer, this is what I'm doing for that, right?
Yep.
And to your point, facilitation of payment is way different than marketing and reseller fees and hidden commissions and things like that. So that's a good clarification.
Yeah. Just because it happens and different companies will pursue it differently. And I don't have a problem if there's a value, like you say, a value associated with that service or providing that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to circle back. So Mike, when I posited the question originally, how do PBMs not act in the best fiduciary interests? You provided a great example, which is when a clinical replacement isn't recommended to a patient because there's more kickback involved. What are some other examples that we can give out to the broker community of ways in which a PBM might not be operating in good, high fiduciary standing in alignment with your client?
I mean, another example might be if the PBM owns a specialty pharmacy and that specialty pharmacy is probably the highest price specialty pharmacy in the market, but you are requiring all the members of the plan to use the specialty pharmacy that they own, then is that in the best interest of the client? So or another example might be, you use the example of a costly drug. But what happens if a more expensive drug that's less clinically effective than a lower cost drug is actually being facilitated? And I want to just kind of blow this myth out of the water. Just because a drug is more expensive does not mean it's more effective. And I think we have a perception in the United States that if anything new must be better. If it comes through the FDA, it has to be better. Look at the price of this drug. You keep in mind, just as a reminder for everyone, whenever a pharmaceutical company brings forth a drug for approval by the FDA, it's placebo-controlled studies. That means you're comparing the drug essentially to nothing. So if you're showing that the drug is better than nothing and it's safe, then it's going to get approved by the FDA. But that does not mean it's better than everything else on the market. Mm-hmm. And that's the piece that's often missed. And then when you have PBMs that are given rebates to incentivize the placement of that drug on their formulary, then we certainly have a conflict there. That's another concern.
Yeah, I think to add on to that too, the prior authorization process often gets missed, right? Where if you've kind of got the fox guarding the hen house at that point where you own a specialty pharmacy and you've contracted with the PBM to do the prior authorization on the high cost drug, what incentive do they have to truly go through rigorous clinical criteria and make sure it's the right drug for the right patient? Well, they don't. They don't have that incentive. They have an incentive to stamp the approval to get it to their specialty pharmacy. And I think that's the biggest problem, is you can't be fiduciarily aligned in a model that is built on more means more profit, more money, right? They're not being compensated to hold costs down. They get compensated more as costs go up. And that's where we see a lot of mismanagement and misunderstanding of the fiduciary side of things. And then you have employers that, they're trusting their consultants to review those contracts for them before they execute them. But there's a lot of times in those contracts, they say, we're not a fiduciary. We contract rebates for ourselves, not you. Mm-hmm. And they're getting executed all day long. But we're starting to see, I think, some of those cards fall with some of the litigation that's come out.
As we know, sitting at this table, the broker community is seeing a little bit of a slow but certain turnover in generations, right? It's a relatively aging community of people. That's factual. I'm not just saying that. Okay.
And like a bunch of old white dudes? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. You can say it. I can. However, we've got a lot of new consultants coming into the space who have to become consultants without a lot of base experience. And so I want to have each of you, if you don't mind, provide one question that if you're counseling a new broker to the space and they don't know how to evaluate PBMs, they have no concept of it. They have no idea what they're doing. Sweethearts, okay? What's one question you would coach them to ask of a PBM when they're in the vetting process? Like, I'll go first, right? Do you provide rebates back to the client? right? Again, this is me not knowing a lot about pharmacy. I'm showing my teeth, right? But that's a question that I would ask. What happens to the rebates? Do they come back to the client, and how do you report that to my client? There's one example. What's something, Mark, that you would train a new broker to ask?
So, and there's a lot of questions, as you might imagine.
Write a book on it, but
another one might be: do you allow for a third-party audit of 100% of the claims? Because a lot of times contracts restrict what you can audit, and so can you audit 100% of the claims? That would be a good question.
Yep. That's a great one, and we also talk about that on the claim doc side here. We want audit rights for everything, and a lot of PPO contracts don't allow for that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think one question would, if I had to stick to one, right? Because it's going back
you can
to like
do two if
we ask so many, and that's what we get paid to do, is ask all the right questions. But one would just be, how do you make money? Explain to me how you make money, and that typically will point you down a path of, okay, this is how the PBM makes money. And then the second follow-up question to that would be, does the way you make money align with the client that I'm trying to advise? So that's kind of a question back to yourself as a new advisor. So if this PBM makes money in this way, is that aligned with my client and their patients?
Can you give an example of what would be a bad way?
Gosh, there's so many.
Yeah.
A bad way to make money, in my opinion, and what we've seen really increase costs, is just undisclosed margins through spread pricing, rebate retention, manufacturer administrative fees, all of the ways that, as we discussed a little bit earlier, inflate costs. And when costs go up, they make more money. So it's just, that's the bad way to make money, in my opinion, is in misalignment and with the goals of your true client. Yeah. And I always say you're using other people's paychecks, whether it be a big check from the employer that's commingled funds, or someone at the pharmacy that's paying a generic, you're using their checkbook to fund it.
Yeah.
What we've seen is a lot of overspend when incentives are misaligned.
Yeah.
And so when you can tailor that back and align the incentives to actually doing the right thing and contractually obligate to them, it's amazing how quickly that can reduce some of the overspend.
Yeah.
I've got one more question for you before we kick it to Mike. Can you explain? I know he's like, please stop asking me things. Can you give us a quick and dirty explanation of what spread pricing is for our audience?
Yeah, I think spread pricing is, most simply put, the difference between what an employer or patient is charged and what the pharmacy is actually paid.
Okay.
So some consultants that advisors, brokers that I've talked to still believe that the PBMs are actually like, you're paying them for a drug. You're not actually paying the PBM for a drug. You're paying the PBM to then facilitate a payment to a pharmacy.
To be a channel, right?
Or facilitate a rebate with a pharmaceutical manufacturer. So that's where, if you think about it in a simple term, in a self-funded plan, right? I get an invoice from my PBM, and then the PBM gets those funds and then pays the pharmacy. If there's a difference in those amounts, that's spread pricing. And it's really come under attack lately because of the lack of transparency and the lack of ability to understand and hold someone accountable to what they're doing. If you don't know how much you're paying an employee to do a job, how do you hold them accountable to their results, right? And it really comes back to that with all of your vendor partners, right? ClaimDoc is a great example. Your clients know what they're paying you, and they know the results you're delivering.
Right.
It's really easy to do an ROI and accountability situation there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Mike, one of your boys is like, Dad, I want to be a benefits consultant. What do I need to know about PBMs?
I kind of hope they go into the trades.
Yeah, right.
I don't have to pay for college, but I would.
You don't have to go to college to be a broker.
That's very true. I was at a career fair the other day, and that's what I was telling all the teenagers is I would hire somebody right out of school as long as you had good work ethic. That's all I care about.
And you're going to do the right thing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I'm gonna add on to what Trevor said a little bit, because I focus a lot on how a vendor gets paid, right? And you can ask them that question. I tell you, like, a new PBM pops up every other week, right? They're always calling. I got the best solution out there. So there's a lot of shiny objects that you can chase. So I say start with how you get paid and immediately follow up with, can you contractually guarantee that? And can I see a sample contract? Because I can't tell you how many times a salesperson has promised X and the contract comes through and it's not in there. And guess what? At the end of the day, email does not win, contract wins because it's got a signature on it.
Right. That's right. Right. And the salesperson's long gone by the time you've gotten to that part of the contract.
And that's actually what has happened.
Yeah.
Yes, you promised me this and you're not at the company anymore. Right. Who's gonna do that?
Who's going to make good on your promise?
Well, and I did want to tag on to that because that's a great point. My experience has been there's often a big gap between proposal to contract and then contract to performance.
Yes.
And the accountability between those two major gaps is significant. And you have to close those gaps. You have to ensure that the proposal matches that contract, and you have to ensure that the performance is going to match up to the contract as well. That comes back to the audit question as well.
Yeah, that's all great advice for our future brokers of America. That's very good. That's great advice. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. But when we come back for part 2, we're going to talk about international drug sourcing. We're going to talk about which drug prices we're most concerned about and why we should maybe be concerned about other ones. We're going to get back to that. So stick around for next month's episode of Claim Talk. Thanks for being here. And don't forget, wherever you're watching our podcast right now, make sure you like the episode, you subscribe so that you know when our next episode is coming out. You get notifications for that. And we'll see you next month.